Turn up the mic. Here we go. Welcome, everyone, to this session on comparing sustainability with a net zero score. I am Alexander Schmidt. I am the head of science and climate research at Swedish Normative. And Normative helps companies to accurately measure and reduce their full carbon footprint. In that capacity, we're also collaborating with several organizations like UN Race to Zero, Oxford Net Zero, Exponential Roadmap Initiative, Nordea and others, some of which you're going to see in a few minutes on the panel to discuss this very interesting topic. Now, before we dive into the panel and hear all the panelists' view on this topic, I would love to help us all to set the scene a bit, as comparing sustainability is, of course, a very, very broad theme. So for this, I would like to welcome Normative's co-founder and CEO, Christian Rönn, on stage. Christian has a background in academia from the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford, after which he founded Normative. And please share a bit your view on what we do right now to compare sustainability and what is, of course, missing in that realm. So thank you very much. Try that
one. Let's see if we can... Okay, mic is now working wonderfully. Okay, so thanks a lot for having me. I'm super excited for this session. I just want to say, I mean, so much kind of intellectual work has gone into this. So first of all, as Alex said, I'm the CEO and co-founder of Normative. What we do at Normative is that we deliver carbon accounting to large enterprises and enterprises in general, and give them actionable insights on specific things they can do in order to reduce their emissions, both in their own operations, but quite crucially in their value chain as well. And we have been doing that for almost a decade. And our mission for the past decade has been to make known and to reduce the sustainability impact of all economic activities on the planet. So a very ambitious mission. And what I'm going to present somewhat, it relates to that overall mission, and the entire session relates to that mission. So the name of the session is Comparing Sustainability with a Net Zero Score. And I'm going to give you a little bit of context in the next few minutes, what we mean by that exactly. So, to take a step back, global emissions are rising. I mean, we're all aware of it. We need to act fast. And the thing is that at the same time, there is a lot of regulatory and voluntary efforts to curb emissions. And moreover, there's a lot of ratings out there. A lot of ratings that tries to capture the sustainability of different companies. But none of those ratings are focused specifically on net zero progress. So for instance, MSCI is a general ESG metric. You can get a good score without necessarily making progress towards net zero. CDP is another great effort that gives you an amazing snapshot of your overall carbon disclosures, which is great, but it doesn't necessarily tell you, from one year to another, have you reduced enough emissions? So what we want to do, and what we have invited a group of stakeholders to do, is to ask ourselves the question, can we empower these existing efforts to better capture progress towards net zero in a very transparent way? So what exactly do we need in order to make meaningful progress towards net zero? And what does the anatomy of a score need to be in order to measure that progress? So first of all, we need any type of score to be net zero focused. As you might have heard from Johan Rockström yesterday, he had a great phrase that you can't negotiate with the planet. In order to avoid the global climate catastrophe, we need exponential action. So there is a certain level of reduction that we need to have and that we need to get to. That is non-optional and non-negotiable. So any type of score needs to capture that type of dynamic of being focused around carbon law and being focused around net zero. Secondly, there is the question of completeness. So whenever you look at the carbon disclosures of businesses or their net zero targets for that matter, it is important to remember that around 85% of emissions typically originate in the value chain. So it is extremely important to fully capture the carbon emissions, both in their own operations and in the value chains. Moreover, unfortunately today, a lot of enterprise value chain emissions are not covered by net zero targets. And we talked about that in our session yesterday. We actually had a look at 1,000 companies with net zero targets. And if you look at those 1,000 companies, they are responsible for around 80% of global emissions. So it is quite crucial that companies take their full emissions, including their value chain, into account. Then thirdly, in order to measure progress towards net zero, we need some sort of reliable metric that all stakeholders can trust. I mean, in the end of the day, you see kind of this dynamics and push and pull between different stakeholders. So for instance, consumers and citizens, they might elect government officials that take climate change seriously. Those governments might push legislation towards the financial sector to fully disclose and reduce their portfolios, which in turn trickle down towards enterprises. So any meaningful way to track progress towards net zero needs to be reliable, which means that it needs to be comparable across different legal entities. So that I can, as for instance an investor, see that, okay, this legal entity is doing better than this legal entity. And then fourth, any type of score needs to be transparent. So, I mean, we can't have any sort of a black box when it comes to net zero emissions. And more specifically, our philosophy around the net zero score that we're going to discuss more about very soon is quite simple. The whole idea is quite intuitive, and you can kind of capture it in just one sentence. That what matters in the end of the day is verified necessary reduction. So what do you mean exactly by verified necessary reduction? Well, as I said before on the net zero focus slide, you have a certain level of reduction that needs to happen. It's non-optional and non-negotiable because you can't negotiate with nature. So there's a percentage of reduction that different industries need to have on a year-to-year basis in order to be on a net zero pathway. So that is one dimension of the score. But the other dimension is the verified part, and that relates to accuracy. So, I mean, any company can claim to have reduced a lot of emissions, but that claim is worthless unless there is accuracy in that claim. And that relates to the overall completeness of the data set, right? So you need to have, a certain level of accuracy in order for a reduction claim to be valid. So in the end of the day, the way we structure this score is to simply say, okay, to what percentage of reduction have you achieved? And then scaling that by how trustworthy is that claim. And we are outlining this in a methodological framework paper exactly on what we mean by that accuracy component. But I'm not going to go into it now. So the whole idea is to make it super, super simple for any stakeholders to see for any given company, is this company reducing emissions enough, and are they doing it fast enough from a year-to-year basis? So what is the overall pathway forward in order to make net zero progress? So we need something that is more accessible and transparent. And the way we want to do that is to build upon existing frameworks. build upon existing frameworks like PCAF, Greenhouse Gas Protocol, science-based targets, and see this as an amendment of existing ratings, but specifically focused on net zero. And that means focusing on that single outcome, right? Have a laser focus on net zero specifically. And then thirdly, this is not something that any one player can do alone, but we need a collaborative approach where several stakeholders kind of agree on what is the pathway forward, how should we measure progress towards net zero. And that is why we have invited this group of stakeholders to this session today. And yeah, so that's a little bit of the context.
Thank you very much, Christian, for this nice introduction. And as we were talking now about collaboration, I would love to welcome, so you please stay on stage. I would love to welcome the other two panelists live here. So one is Kaja Axelsson from Oxford Net Zero, there as policy engagement lead. So please come on stage, Kaja. And we have also Johan Falk here, one of the initiators of the Exponential Roadmap, beyond many other, or besides many other hats that he is wearing. We also have one contribution online from Stefan Henningsson, who hopefully can dial in. Stefan is a senior climate specialist at Nordea. So welcome, Stefan, also there in probably, I think, Denmark, or where you are sitting right now. All right.
Thank you.
To build upon what we just heard from Christian around the whole challenge, the landscape that is quite complex and not entirely, well, let's say sometimes not entirely helpful to focus on the net zero progress outcome, I would love first to give the word to Kaja. Kaja, you are deeply involved in the net zero space with your research, with the collaborations there. I would love to hear from you a bit what kind of key challenges you have uncovered in your net zero research. And of course, happy to share anything else that you are doing right now on the net zero progress topic. If you three could share that microphone, that would be brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you. So again, I'm Kaja. I work for the University of Oxford, and we have a tracker that you can go look at. It's zerotracker.net. And it's a public tracker of what companies are saying in their sustainability reports. So again, to Christian's point about transparency, we're actually paying attention. Every single media, press announcement, news report, anything on the internet that companies are saying, especially in the Forbes 2000 list, we're paying attention to. And what we find from that, in line with the previous figures, is that actually depressingly 2/3 of companies in the Forbes 2000 list have not set a net zero target, emphasizing the need for regulation to kind of bring up that tail. But encouragingly, the number of companies that have set a net zero target rose from 1 in 5 last year at COP to 1 in 3 this year, our most recent stock take. And new companies pledge net zero every single week. And with that explosion of net zero commitment from corporations increases skepticism. People are very concerned that net zero is just a delay tactic. So one of the things that we find, and I use a simple acronym called SCORE. If you're around a dinner table, you're trying to understand how do net zero targets score. The first S in SCORE is short-term or interim targets. About 2/3 of companies with net zero targets do not have sufficient short-term interim targets, and even fewer than those follow what the Exponential Roadmap sets out and what Rockstrom and scientists set out as kind of the global benchmark around the carbon law. What we globally need to do is have emissions by 2030. Very few companies are setting out sufficiently towards that. So that's one concern that we have. And then within that, there's coverage. So the coverage of greenhouse gases. We don't just need to focus on carbon. And also we know methane is very potent. If it's not as long-lived, it's still very potent. And then scope coverage. Actually, one of the most depressing findings I have to offer is that 6 in 10 net zero claiming companies does not have full or sufficient, according to SBTI, scope 3 coverage. And so that's really an area where we need to improve data transparency, but also just effort. I think companies are very concerned that that's out of of their control, that their supply chains are separate to them. But what is true is that we work in a system, and companies have so much leverage that they're not using. It's time for them to lean in and to work with their suppliers, to empower and finance their suppliers, not to just walk away, but to work with them. And so I think a huge part of this score is not just whether Scope 3 is covered, but also looking at the data. A lot of the data on Scope 3 coverage is very incomparable at the moment, and a lot of it use averages or proxies. So that's one thing that I think is covered. Or I think there's a lot of people thinking about this right now, about how do we improve data accuracy and measurement. Reporting has some better news. About 2/3 of net zero claiming companies report very often on their emissions data, and that's not any surprise because now 50% of the globe will be covered by some form of mandatory disclosure framework by 2025. So this is how you see regulation comes in and then companies respond. And the final E in the score framework is equity. Less than 10% of companies, and this is very hard to measure, but less than 10% of companies actually explicitly refer to how communities, including workers, local communities, and the global community most impacted by climate change will be affected in their net zero targets.
Back on. Thank you. Those were indeed sometimes depressing numbers, but really insightful numbers. We need the insights actually to drive this. We often say that there's no shame right now by having a high carbon emission footprint. The shame or kind of the blame would then arise if you either do not fully cover your footprint or if you intentionally try to hide parts of it. So I think right now let's put all the facts on the table and then try to address them. And speaking of addressing them, you already mentioned Johan and the exponential roadmap. Johan, you are in your work, and I would love to hear more about it, of course, or we all, very much focus on action pieces, right? Insights driving action. Maybe you can share a bit with all of us how you work with Exponential Roadmap and what is kind of the action piece that you are focused on.
Yes, thank you. We're very excited about this collaboration. And why is that? Well, as the Exponential Roadmap initiative, we are bringing together what we call leading transformers and disruptors with the same mission. And that mission is halving emissions by 2030 through exponential climate action and solutions. So that's what we built our initiative on. And we have gathered companies which represent something like $900 billion in annual revenue. So also very powerful companies in the front line. We put very high requirements on these companies to join the Exponential Roadmap initiative. I would say the highest possible standards. And we are an accredited party of the UN Race to Zero. And what the companies commit to is follow the carbon law. I would say we were basically born from the carbon law 2017. And Johan Rockström is our co-chair, and the carbon law states we need to halve emissions every decade. So it's a rule of thumb, but based on science. And I would add, we also need to protect nature at the same time. So that's a carbon law, okay? But the companies we onboard, they are committed to halve their own Scope 1, 2 emissions, but also their value chain emissions, do their utmost to do that by 2030, which is incredibly challenging for companies. But also we go beyond that, actually scaling climate solutions as well, but also contributing to global net zero. So that's also what we're talking about here. You won't succeed even if you can't reach net zero on your own. You have to do it with your value chain. And I would state even you cannot do it even with your value chain. We have to do it together in the global economy. So the leading companies also have to contribute to all the global net zero work. And one example is this 1.5 business playbook that we developed together with our members, basically providing a handbook for what are the actions required across these 4 pillars that companies can take in order to be on top on delivering a 1.5 aligned strategy. So therefore this is very relevant for us.
Excellent. Thank you for this view on things, and it leads, of course, very well into the research that we see here. Like coverage is important, action is important, and you mentioned the need to have kind of a globally united push, right? It doesn't just help if one company does one thing good or bad. We really need to have it kind of like a global support system. And part of support systems, of course, are standards, are frameworks, are guidelines that we're going to talk about in a minute a bit more. Maybe quickly from Christian, because you already touched upon a few frameworks, a few guidelines out there. You dropped a few names. Maybe for the audience, could you just deep dive into what you would consider the most relevant frameworks and standards that are out there right now, and maybe also showing a bit the gap that we have to bridge. And if you could share the microphone, that would be perfect.
So more specifically in relation to the net zero score and capturing progress towards net zero in a framework of our carbon law, there is a couple of standards that are really quite crucial and relevant that we build upon, right? And one of them is the greenhouse gas protocol. So the greenhouse gas protocol outlines how to account for carbon emissions. However, the greenhouse gas protocol doesn't always yield comparable results at the moment. As Kaja pointed out, especially results in Scope 3 can vary with quite a bit. So there's several industry initiatives to patch that part. So there's the World Business Council for Sustainable Development initiative, they're called the Pathfinder Initiative, that is trying to bridge that gap in Scope 3. There is also the Carbon Call industry initiative that is trying to make that more accurate. But then there is also the question around access to data, because right now, today, all companies do not disclose their carbon emissions. And especially if you're someone in the financial industry, you need to know, or at least to be able to have some approximate estimate of what are the emissions of this particular company. So another relevant standard there is the PCAF standard that kind of outlines different data quality brackets. So for instance, if I don't have direct reported data for a specific company, then I might be allowed to substitute that for an industry average in order to get some sort of overview of the overall portfolio. So I think those things combined, and also not to forget to mention, science-based targets initiative that kind of, sets a benchmark for where companies needs to be, in terms of their net zero targets. So I think there's a couple of standards that needs to be brought together in order to kind of on a year-to-year basis track progress that companies are taking towards net zero emissions.
And ultimately, of course, leading to more conversions, right? Because we can, of course, I can imagine any one of us has ideas around how we can improve the space. But if we all start with our own ideas and just have, these islands of knowledge and they're not connected, this will just lead to more fragmentation. You already mentioned financial sector and PCAF. We have luckily Stefan who dialed in. So again, thank you for joining us remotely, Stefan. Nordea has recently announced a partnership with Normative to help Nordea's business customers to also accurately first assess and then subsequently reduce their emissions. Stefan, could you explain a bit how you see the role of finance, of financial sector in general, in this whole making progress towards net zero, making progress comparable? What is the role of finance there, Stefan?
I think it came up, and thank you very much for having me presenting here from Stockholm, actually, to Egypt. But it came up in the introduction by Christian here that corporates have 85% emissions or more in the value chain, and for financial institutions generally I'd say that's more. Much more of emissions than 85% in the value chain when you come into portfolio emissions, which is associated with investment portfolios and lending portfolios, such as for Nordea Group. And so we follow then the finance emissions accounting standard on that for PCAF. And that is then when it comes to also linking to the verification that you mentioned, then is called PCAF Data Quality Score 1. And of course, that is what we are striving towards achieving, but we are certainly not at PCAF Data Quality Score 1 across the asset classes where we have in our lending portfolio or in our listed equity and corporate bonds portfolios today. But that is this data quality improvement is very, very important for the whole of the financial sector, and certainly from Nordea Group. We have a target then for our emissions portfolios for the portfolios for 40 to 50% reduction by 2030 compared to 2019. For our own operational footprint, where we have full operational control, we've adopted the carbon law that Johan mentions, and at least 50%, and the rest then offset by emission removals. But yes, coming back to the portfolios, that is a very valuable then for us with a Normative partnership in order to get emissions data, not least from the very most difficult subsegment here, which is small and medium-sized enterprises, and we do a lot of lending to that segment from Nordea, and the data availability there is very low. So here we can help clients to develop with Normative and the business carbon calculator a reliable greenhouse gas data for the first time, and then set target, and then we can also link then sustainability linked loans and other products in order for our clients to also achieve their targets.
Excellent. Thank you, Stefan, for this view on the topic. And you mentioned small and medium businesses. 100%. Those are, of course, making up the majority of businesses globally, though, of course, they usually have quite low negotiating power to begin with. But then, of course, through making, for example, with Nordea, insights more tangible as to how sustainable are those companies and what is actually there, where do they stand on their own net zero journey, that's, of course, insightful for large businesses then in turn. So if we speak about large businesses and their role, Johan, you already mentioned your work with Exponential Roadmap. And you also have this initiative, the 1.5 supply chain leaders. Maybe you could elaborate from your point of view, what is the role of large businesses in this whole push towards more comparability, or how would they also benefit from more comparability in the sustainability realm?
Yeah. Yes. So we are very much an action initiative, because I think everyone agrees that we are beyond pledges, basically, and we've done so many pledges for companies, so it is all about action, but actually also showing results and doing that in an accurate way. And one of the initiatives we have set up is the 1.5 supply chain leaders. So we're gathering 15 some of the leading companies like IKEA, Microsoft, and so on, working together basically on supporting their suppliers to halve their emissions by 2030, because suppliers down in the chain need a lot of support, and it's a particular responsibility of the large companies, the keystone actors, to accelerate that process and also contribute with best practice. And what could that be? Well, for example, what IKEA is doing, supporting their suppliers to switch to renewable electricity. There are great practices around that. But it could also be methodology, of course, things like the business playbook, or we develop something called the supplier engagement guide with best practices on how you can engage with your suppliers further down in the chain, because it has to trickle down. So that's an example of an initiative which basically can help accelerate. And whatever we do in that initiative is absolutely open, which I think is a key. We don't keep anything internally. We share everything 100% and encourage every other company to basically copy what's being done there. And all these companies we're working with are very positive to do that, not keep it internally, but actually having other companies to sort of steal the best ideas, because we can't, the problem is it's not sufficient to just diffuse these ideas. We need to share the absolute best practices as quickly as possible. And here it would be very useful to have good scores so that you can actually track the progress in your supply chain and in the value chain, by the way, because we think that actually a KPI you can set is, I want what we will do in our organization, 100% of our suppliers should be aligned with the 1.5 ambitions, and the customers as well. That's a very bold target, but absolutely natural, because you won't be able to succeed through the value chain unless you line up your suppliers and your customers. So you should influence in both ends, as far as I see it. Yeah.
you can quickly add on to the Christian, because you mentioned the statistics before. You just mentioned, Johan, about the importance of assessing then also your value chain with, for example, a score that you can actually say this is how sustainable a certain supplier is. That leads back to the question, of course, of the power of that then these enterprises would have to make meaningful progress. Christian, could you elaborate on the number you dropped before, around like 1,000 businesses actually having pledged to become net zero?
Okay, so I think all of us are aware of the UN emissions gap report and the fact that if we add up government commitments to net zero, there is a huge gap, and we're heading towards 2.8 degrees. So what we did is that we looked at 1,000 companies with net zero targets and their overall value chain-based emissions. Turns out that if you look at their overall scope 3 and value chain, it equates to 80% of global emissions, approximately. So there is this huge power of taking scope 3 seriously. And you can think about it, like, it's going to be impossible to decarbonize the world economy unless we decarbonize our value chains. Any laptop computer that you buy has, thousands of parts and thousands of production steps, everything from mining to transportation, and all of that is located in the scope 3 of businesses. So scope 3 is critical to kind of leverage those network effects to get to net zero, and having some sort of score where you can actually see and compare, like, how are companies doing? Because right now it is very, very hard for me, even if I try my best to go out and say, okay, is this company doing enough in terms of reducing their emissions fast enough? I mean, they might have a net zero target, but are they making progress towards that target? They might disclose their total greenhouse gas emissions, but where are those emissions in relation to where they need to be? So we need simple answers to quite simple questions, which is, okay, how are we really doing here?
Wonderful if we had all these simple answers. And of course, a single number is very attractive to capture this in one, with one kind of look on the paper. But Kaya, I know that from your research and part of the data that Christian was just citing here come actually from the Net Zero Tracker, which you already mentioned. And of course, the world is not that easy. Companies, they do make progress. They have to make progress. So the outcome focus is the proposal of the score. At the same time, we need to see the context. Could you elaborate a bit on kind of the context that you have found in research, quantitative or qualitative measures that are relevant as well?
Thank you so much. Alex knows that I'm an academic, and so I love complexity, and sustainability is a complex system that we've intervened in and pushed the limits of its boundaries. So while I really applaud the development of a score that helps people find a path to net zero, I want to see dotted all along that score, to Johan's point, the real action that people are taking. And so we also use a lot of qualitative indicators to assess whether people are planning for net zero sufficiently. We look at their capital expenditure. We follow the money. We look at whether they have a robust strategy for how they're going to cascade their management to align with net zero, so cascade that target throughout their whole company. We train employees. We look at what companies are really doing in terms of business model innovation. And I think that there's not enough at the moment kind of frameworks to drive business model innovation so that you can think not just, have I drawn a neat little line around my company and now my company is net zero and now I've won. No, that's not the goal. The goal is global net zero. So you need to think not just, am I net zero, but what is my business doing for net zero? And then I think, when Alex and Christian asked me to be on this panel, my first response was, everything you do in sustainability, every action you take has an unintended consequence. What could be this unintended consequence of a score that emphasizes accuracy so much? And my chief concern with a score that emphasizes accuracy is we're already seeing sustainability departments totally transition all of their people away from their sustainability teams and bring in more accountants, because everyone is obsessed with disclosure. They're so afraid that they're measuring wrong, and they're right to be, right? They are measuring wrong most of the time. I mean, if you look at the MSCI or another one of those indexes, CDP, you look at different numbers for the same company, and we have a problem with that. And the ISSB and these disclosure frameworks are starting to converge and come together on a common methodology. So we're working on that. But I also want to make sure that those sustainability teams are full of action people who are going to get on the phone and talk to the person who runs the supply chain for the trucking industry, who does not understand why they need to measure their emissions from A to B. And I want them to cajole and to convince and to finance and to empower those individuals. So I think that at the end of the day, sustainability is about people as much as it is about scores. And I really think people are motivated by scores. So that's why I'm on this stage, but it's more than that.
And that's, of course, also why we're so happy to have you here on the stage. And that, again, highlights the importance of context. Context has to be there to this number, and from this number, actionable insights, actionable steps need to follow. Christian, you want to have a quick comment on that one?
You're saying, Kaya. I mean, I completely agree that in the end of the day, what matters is action. And when you think about accuracy, it's not one of those binary things. Either you're accurate or you're non-accurate. It's a whole gradient. And accuracy matters to the extent that you have high enough resolution data to yield actionable insights. I agree, it's action that matters in the end of the day, and accurate enough where you don't mislead anyone. I think those are the kind of two core things, and you can't be too zealous or absolutist in terms of accuracy.
Perfect. And I think that's actually the perfect segue for Stefan to share a bit your view on how do you think the net zero focus score could help Nordea and their businesses to make meaningful progress?
Well, I think it's a very valuable contribution, sort of KPI to the company transition plan assessment when we look at our portfolio, because that's where our main emissions are. So I'm looking at it from our business, the businesses we are financing or investing in. So then the transition plan assessment on performance, and that's a very big focus on the score, and on data quality is very, very important. And getting this simplistic through the score is key. And I think it could also, with the accounting approach, as Kaya mentioned, and I share your concern there. I can see that more simplistic score also for smaller businesses could, in terms, maybe even be sufficient. It could potentially be linked to a new score for sustainability-linked loans that is building on actual performance, and then having cheaper loans in case you achieve those performance targets. In terms of other factors, though, Kaya said initially 2/3 of larger companies have not yet set the net zero target. So I think that is very important in terms of the assessment and additional KPIs. The medium-term ambition, of course, is there a strategy in place? Kaya was into that as well. An action plan on delivering this. Is there a plan for financing the actions here? Grow proportion of revenues that are green, that also links into the solution wedges in the exponential roadmap, and also the capital allocation alignment that is very, very important here, and also the governance is actually in place, which is one of the key cash questions in TCFD, for example.
Thank you, Stefan. Johan, how would a net zero score help, for example, the 1.5 supply chain leaders to make more progress, if you sum it up in 2 or 3 sentences?
I think it's a way to quite quickly assess your supply chain from a helicopter perspective, so you understand where you're tracking. But I would also add that I think a key point is that the score is absolutely transparent. There is no black box, so you understand it. And so you don't interpret it in the wrong way. So, for example, what we're stating to our member companies is that, well, this is a compass direction. It's non-negotiable. It's basically your 7% per year. If you don't making that, you should really clearly explain what is the reason for that. What are the blockers for that? Reach out to the community and say, well, we need to address these blockers together. That is the best practice. It's not to try to hide that information in a sustainability report so people don't see it, which is happening today, in my opinion. You need to highlight and say, we have strong blockers, we can't break through. That is really important that we also change that practice. But the compass, what you should follow is should be really clear, and it's a way to highlight the gap in between, in my opinion.
Perfect. So kind of a heat map on how well are you on track of your to follow through with this.
Companies need to highlight the blockers and start to collaborate instead of trying to shine as much as possible.
And that also leads to blockers can be highlighted in, of course, more context, more qualitative measures. Kaya, what is your kind of summary takeaway? How would that a quantitative measure support qualitative measures that you have, for example, in the net zero tracker as well?
I think, for example, when you're thinking about supply chain engagement, you need to have something that motivates companies. And I think a score is one of those things. They can watch themselves climbing up that mountain. You know, you set yourself a challenge and you think, oh, I want to, it's basic gamification, right? But I think also helping people to understand that they're not alone in kind of getting to that score, that to Johan's point, their net zero score achievement, if a company at the size of the types of companies that you work with are struggling also to get up that mountain, then a supply chain leader can kind of extend that arm out to their suppliers. And it looks like more of a collective challenge. I think if we have one goal together and scores that all add up to one big score, maybe that could be a feature for the system.
I love that we went from doom and gloom statistics to gamification. I think this is a great development within 25 minutes. Christian, just to wrap up, what would be the next steps to actually make this score come closer to reality?
Yeah, first of all, we need to continue to have a stakeholder-driven approach around it, like we're having now. And before I answer your question, I just want to take a general step back. I mean, we have right now a commitment gap. We all talk about the commitment gap. But in the end of the day, what matters is action and bridging the action gap. I mean, just committing to something is not enough, but taking the right action and to track the effects of those actions over time is the important part, and why I think a score is important. But to answer your question, the next steps is to be trying this out with a couple of companies and stakeholders in the next year, and really have this stakeholder-driven approach where we can learn, we can get feedback. And I invite everyone here who represent some sort of company or legal entity to come and talk to us. We would love to work together with you.
Excellent. And I hope through the discussion it also became apparent why we are so glad that we have these brilliant minds supporting us with their very honest and straightforward feedback and their different views on kind of this whole space to actually make this net zero score into reality and actually help to lead to more measurable progress towards net zero. So I want to thank you everyone, also Stefan who dialed in, for joining us today, for sharing your views, your opinions and your experience here with us. And yeah, for any questions, as Christian said, reach out. We're looking forward to develop this framework over the next few months. And thank you everyone for your time and attention.